Hello and welcome to the podcast this week. And I am joined with Al and Scott from the Adoption and Fostering podcast. And I don't know what's going to happen in this show. I'm slightly anxious. Anything could happen. If you've listened to their podcast, you'll know that I'm going to have to really manage these boys.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello. Good evening.
Hello.
You see, they're off already. Okay. They're off already. Yeah. Right, this is my show, right? I'm going to ask the questions, right?
I'm going to behave. I'm behaving. I'm going to be
Fingers on lips.
Can I just say that this is also a technical first because there's 3 people on this podcast and this hasn't been done before. This will be, as you know, I have my podcast on YouTube for people who like the visual experience. Thank you. And God, where do we start? Are you having a great weekend, first of all?
Scott, you answer that question.
I know. Who do you want to have? Well, I guess I am. I mean, it's a bank holiday in the UK or in England, isn't it? But it's not where I am because obviously I'm in Ireland. So we've gone back to school today. So that's been interesting.
Excellent.
So yes, I have. Anyway, that was my weekend.
And you, Al?
I've had a really. Firstly, how honest do you want us to be?
I only want pure honesty, Al. That's really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for pure honesty. I'm looking for deep diving. I'm looking for stuff that makes you feel slightly uncomfortable. That's how I'm thinking this is going to run.
Right. Okay. So I had a phone call with the police on about 8:00 on Friday about one of my children, and they were just so fantastic. They were just so reassuring, and they were so insightful and empathic, and listened to me, and responded to me, and put it all to bed. So I had a freaking awesome weekend.
That is so good to hear. I love it because you know that I work across all the services, so you will know. That makes me really happy that you had an incident, I'm guessing.
Yes, let's call it an incident or two.
Let's call it an incident. So you had an incident and the police responded appropriately and well. And more than that, you came away from that feeling really positive.
Yeah, almost empowered.
Wow.
Yeah. You weren't expecting that answer, were you?
Well, I'm intrigued. So in what way?
Well, in a sense, I wasn't looking for any action. I was looking for just them to kind of keep information safe, and they did that. But it was just so nice to talk to. There was this real sense of common sense, a real palpable. Oh, we hear you. That makes perfect sense. We're going to take that what you've said. We're going to put it somewhere. We're going to keep it safe, and we're not going to do anything with it until you want us to do something with it. And it was exactly what I needed, and it was really reassuring and. He kind of put the whole family's kind of anxieties at ease. And so it was a really, really good response, and it was good fun, and we had a right laugh on the conversation, but that's maybe me. And then she pointed me towards some victim support, which I thought was wonderful.
That's fantastic. And I mean, that's going to take us really into quite a deep dive, because one of the things that you do, I've listened to quite a few of your podcasts.
Oh, God bless you.
I know, somebody has to. And
yes.
I've listened to some of your podcasts. I'm your fan. And one of the things that's come up, one of the things that I've really, really listened to and heard is some of the stories that you share are very sensitive and quite difficult and challenging. And adoption is a messy, messy space, isn't it? I mean, it's not an easy space to navigate. You've only got to hang out on Twitter or in a Facebook group for 5 minutes to know that this is a really messy space. And it got me thinking about what does it mean to be a podcaster when you're dealing with these really complicated issues, and how you navigate those and really ensure a kind of sensitive approach to stories that have a thread that runs through them but are actually really, really different.
Scott?
Oh, evil. I think a really, really good question, because I think that when I think back to when we first started the podcast, I think we just, well, I thought nobody would listen, to be honest with you. And it was a different time as well. We're only talking 3 years this
Yeah.
September. Yeah. So we're only talking 3 years, but actually it's a very different time. And I remember a lot of conversations with Al about how honest and open we should be, how honest and open we could be, because it is, we have to kind of protect some of the stuff that goes on, and we don't share everything. Oh my days, if we were to share everything, it just wouldn't. It wouldn't. Yeah, you can laugh. I mean, but we have done some edits. We have had to edit some stuff out. We've obviously kind of changed names. But it was. I find it really difficult to start with, to share in terms of oversharing. I have a thing about oversharing anyway, as Al will confirm, because even if you look on Twitter, there is quite a lot of oversharing, and I think that the main thing for me is when I come off a podcast recording, it's like my little support group. I feel I do come off. I don't know how Al feels about it, but once I've finished that recording, I'm kind of running on some form of adrenaline, because I've been able to get off my chest what I wanted to get off my chest in a way that I felt able to do it. I may have had to kind of take some information out, or I may have been a little bit delayed in what I'm saying because I'm thinking about what I'm about to say or how I'm about to say it, to make it what's the word? I guess sympathetic to some people who might be listening, might find it hard to listen, because we really don't know who our listeners are. Yes, we know that adopters listen, but actually who else listens, we don't know. So, I think we just have to be very careful about what it is we say, or not what we say, but how we say it. And that's really hard. And I think that, very recently on Twitter, we've seen that as well. The way people word things, it's a real issue, because some people can take things the wrong way, or can kind of, I don't know, they're just not, I don't know, I don't want to go down the old Twitter thing, because that's quite messy at the minute, but it's just, it's not meant to sound like anybody's saying anything about any group of people or anything like that. It's just, this is our experience, and that is what we're sharing. It's nothing else, nothing more. And yeah. Al?
Yeah.
Sorry. What I was going to maybe add to that is that we thought long and hard really about getting. We had a lot of people come to us and sort of say, "I'd love to tell my story," and if I'm honest, I was really reluctant, because if I'm really honest, I'm an adopter, and I've heard lots of adoption stories, and they're all unusual and they're all peculiar, and most of them are remarkable and complicated and messy and murky and wonderful and terrible, all of that. Do we need more stories from adopters? Well, not really, but we did it as a kind of experiment, and I think we did that, and then we moved on to foster carers, and we moved on to adoptees, which I think has been really interesting. But I think the stance we've always taken is your story is your story. This idea that people are experts of their own experience. And I'll be really honest and say that some of the stories that, especially the adopters, have come on, I thought, I'm not sure I like that story, and I don't necessarily like how you said that. But is that for me to curate how people speak and edit, or is it for me to then say that language you've used is perhaps outdated, or the way you've perhaps reflected on a birth family? Is that my role to police you? Not sure it is, and that's maybe not my style. And with adoptees, we've always had the caveat is that you can tell your story, but you can't tell anyone else's, because that's one of the key things that have come back from a lot of the adoptees we've spoken to. Is they say, I don't feel like I own my story. So I've said to adopters, tell me your story, but I'm not interested in your children. That's their business. So tell me what your story is, because you can tell me everything then. And so there's been a few times I've said, I'm going to cut that bit out because it's about your children and I don't want to know about it. Because I do all the editing. I said that in a really I do all the editing. And Scott does nothing. He just tweets.
Yeah, all of that is just really fascinating, and perhaps stuff that people don't really think about who listen to the podcast. They don't think about how much energy goes into thinking about this, how much thought, the caveats at the beginning, which I also have, which are, if you're unsure about this subject, then get a friend to listen, to make sure that, it would be okay for you to listen to. I mean, all the time you're holding a space for somebody. But I think that's interesting what you're saying. Is it for me to police the messages? And I really identify with that. A few of my books, I've brought in stories. I've wanted to share other people's stories in my books. That's very much a big part of what I enjoy doing. And in The Brightness of Stars, there was a story that I wasn't over keen on. And I kind of thought, is it for me to not have this story in here just because I'm not over keen on it? And I chose to put it in. And someone has actually come up to me and said, I'm so glad you put that story in, because if you hadn't, I wouldn't have been able to identify with anyone else. And so that was a really good lesson for me in understanding that it's not really for me. If somebody is coming through me in that sense, it's not really for me to decide how that message should be, which leads me on, interestingly, to thinking about what you're talking about, which is how people hear what they hear through our lenses and through our own perception. And again, when I share personally, which I do from time to time on Twitter, what I find is that I get back what people have heard, and often what people have heard makes them feel like they want to, send me hugs or, tell me everything's going to go on.
No, I was thinking, I'll give you anti-hugs, tell you to F off.
Nobody, Al, tells me to F off. I don't know what you do on Twitter, but nobody tells me to do that.
Really? I mean, it's interesting because for years and years, Twitter's been a really safe environment that's been owned by adopters. And recently that's changed. And I've got the odd, would I say a troll? Or I've got a few people who have a clear vendetta against me or can't bear the sight of me. But I think they see it through their lens. But I think this idea of, is it hermeneutics? Because I think, and I deal with this as a social worker, because I'm a social worker in fostering, is that what people think is then, are they able to communicate that? So that's one filter. And then are they able to communicate that in a way that I can understand? So what do I hear? And that's another filter. And then what do I tweet back is another filter. There's so many steps to actually just cocking this up massively. And Twitter is just fraught with that because, if you think that someone doesn't like you, everything they tweet reinforces that. If you think someone's a pillock, everything reinforces that, even if it's that interpretive filter that is in the between. And I deal with that, when I'm doing Form Fs and things, you kind of have some...
Edutwitter's the same. the same. I mean, I've seen people virtually weeping at the end of a conversation in the education platform in Twitter. It's so polarized and reflects much of what's kind of going on in the world, But I do think this is really interesting around perception and what do we do with that? How do we deal with that? I mean, have you had any experiences where people have been really outraged by stuff that you've had on your show?
Have we, Scott?
Wait a minute, I'll ring the complaints department and ask.
We do have a complaint. We have a comedy complaints department.
I can't think off the top of my head that anybody's ever said anything to... No. I think because, like you just touched on earlier, Lisa, I think because we have that caveat at the beginning that this is our story, the guest story, and some of the interviews that we do similar to yours with professionals who know what they're talking about rather than just us, etc., etc. I think that there's always that caveat that it's their opinions and stuff like that. And I think that's a good thing about podcasts. If it was on a television channel, as an example, you could imagine, couldn't you? You hear all this stuff about the BBC and
impartiality and that.
Exactly, all this sort of stuff. And I think that that's the difference between being able to do a podcast, because podcasts are quite personal. They're like radio shows almost, aren't they? But they're recorded. And I think that that's a good thing about it. That because we kind of touch on subjects that people may want to listen to, and we don't. I mean, we've never had any barmies. It has to be said, any barmies.
Well.
But where we've really disagreed on something. We're always on the similar lines. It's just maybe our opinions on how to deal with it might be different or something like that. So I think
There was that one guest we fell out with.
You've
That you
fallen
fell out
out with a guest.
No, I didn't. Can I just say?
No, not you, Scott. Obs. Al,
Obs.
what happened? What happened? What?
Yeah, it was. In some ways, it was a set. It was not a setup, but it was a very full and frank exchange of views. It was with Martin Barrows. So it was about fostering and the mechanics of fostering, and I guess there was a lot of overstatement. So it was like a Twitter exchange, but in person. So there was no. It was very amicable, and it remains very amicable. We're Facebook friends, and that's a measure of how amicable we are. But it was just a full. I think you're totally wrong. So it was not abusive. I think you're absolutely wrong, and he kind of thought, I think you're absolutely wrong, and we just had this proper hoo-ha. But I think, like Scott says, that we go out of our way not to make enemies, and so when anyone's story, and I think you do the same, Scott, as we say to them, you get to listen to this, you get full editorial control. When we do the stories, anyway, if there's one bit of it you don't like and you want to pull the whole thing, pull the whole thing. I'm not gonna do anyone over, especially when it's matters of such importance. Whereas the guests, probably like you found out, is we just say, well, this is what it is, and if you don't say anything stupid, or tell us if you want something taken out. And I think one person once has asked us to snip something out.
Yeah, there's something very different, though. Again, speaking from experience, there's something very different in sharing from that very personal space, which can feel, it can leave you with a vulnerability hangover. So having the options of being able to edit that in some way is very protective. So I think that's very different than speaking in a more professional tone. I think certainly for me that feels very different.
Yeah.
Well, I know, Scott, you've had conversations, haven't you? You've had, like, there's one of the interviews you did recently where you had quite a long conversation about certain bits, about the tone. And I'm just really, really, well, you can say yourself what you were doing.
Well, no, because the vulnerability hangover is something that I've suffered with for forever. And I can't even remember what year it was, but we did a Sky News piece when it was National Adoption Week a couple of years ago. And the older two boys wanted to be involved in it. So it must have been 2014, because Jacob had just been placed. And Fraser and Brandon wanted to be involved in it. Jacob couldn't be because he was still a foster child. And as soon as it went from the satellite dish in the front garden, which literally it did because there was a van in the front garden, and it beamed over to Sky News headquarters. And then my friend who worked there sent me a message going, look what's on my screen right now, because it's just freaking. I was going, okay, what on earth have I just done? What on earth have we just done? The boys wanted to take part in it. They knew what they were taking part in. And I think that because something like that happened, I think I've been very open with all three. Well, sorry, not just all three, but obviously Tris as well, because I'm sharing stuff that happens in our life. It's not just my life, it's our life. And I think that was the kind of catalyst for me to say, right, okay, if I do this, are you happy for me to share this story, that story, the next story? Because if you're not, then I won't. And I just won't do it if it's something that we can't agree on as a group of 5 people, because that's just not fair on them. Because it's my story to tell from my perspective, but it's not necessarily the same perspective as a 7-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 21-year-old. And I think we have to be very careful of that, because we just do. It's not it might be our story, but it's not necessarily our perspective.
And I think
that's our guests.
Yeah, there's something really nice about you saying that all 5 of you sit down and have those conversations, because it's like you've got each other's back in that process. But when you're on your own and you're being asked to share a story, or you're wanting to share your story because you feel compelled to start articulating what has happened to you so that you can start to integrate it into who you are. I mean, it's really, you're often making that decision on your own and living with the consequences on your own, which is, again, quite different, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, the last 5 years when I've been working for Adoption UK, it's been, if I've been invited to go and talk at things, so whether it's a conference or, I don't know, some of the evenings that Al and I have done as well, where we've shared information about child and parent violence and stuff like that, I'm always a bit wary before I go, because obviously something might come up that actually we haven't discussed as a five, and how do you deal with that? So it is a case of kind of toning it down and just saying, I mean, always with things through Adoption UK, we've always been very clear what's said in the room stays in the room, unless it's some kind of strategy that we might share, or something like that. But I think when you're sharing a personal story, it's really important that is kind of kept within the kind of boundaries of the trust that you have for the people that are listening. And it's not something that you would share with a 400 person kind of conference or something like that. But when you've got 40, 30 people, and you're able to kind of request that kind of just that kind of safe space to be able to share. And I'm thinking about the We Are Family event that Al and I did. It's probably the first time they let us out on their own, and that was quite interesting, because we hadn't done something like that before. So it was really interesting to watch I think it was really interesting to watch each other and how we dealt with stuff like that, because we'd never done something in the same room to the same audience at the same time. And that was really interesting for me, because it kind of made me think about how I would deal with stuff like that in the future. And we've done loads since, but it was just really interesting to listen to somebody else who has had very similar experiences and how they deal with it.
And I mean, I think also as well, when you're doing those kind of things, you're sharing that very personal stuff. I mean, there is always a risk, I find, that you can become your story. And then what happens? What happens when you get so caught up in the story of that title, whether that's as a social worker or as an adopter or as having been in care or as an adoptee. And that's something that can get, because people hear you and they engage with it and they really enjoy it, so they want more of it, so people ask you to do more of it, and before you know it, you are defined by this experience, this one experience out of the many things that tell you who you are.
I worry as well that it becomes, and probably you're an accomplished speaker and Scott and I speak a lot, is that your stories become really polished, and that and often I don't know about Scott, but I'm probably tell my stories a bit less and different ways to Scott, just that's who we are, but I'm really conscious that that anytime you stand on a stage, or the podcast is a stage, in effect, it's a platform, is that even your stories of adversity kind of have this like glitter about them, that even when I tell them, I could tell some stories that are pretty dark, pretty, really desperate times in our family life. And I think that, but doing it from a stage still presents them as a done deal. This is all, but it all worked out okay. There was and you think, oh, but that's not the story. That veneer, it's not sure bits glitz, but it's this sense of not romanticizing. I'm really struggling to articulate myself, but I do worry that often if I tell a story that's always very difficult, that it becomes like, oh, well, yeah, but it's okay, and that's the kind of romanticized, or it's edified when it's just not. And and Scott and I share 5% of our stories, 10%.
Yeah.
It's been I mean.
I think we share what's relevant to the podcast as well, and what's maybe happened. The hashtag info banter, which is trademarked by Adopting Fostering Podcast, is part of it, because actually, as an adoptive parent, I have always used my humour in a way that maybe other parents would find a little bit weird and sickening. I don't know. And the one piece of feedback we had from day one, so those first 2 episodes where Al interviewed me and then put them out as podcasts, that was the one thing that everybody said was really important to them, was the humour of the podcast. But even though we share dark stuff, we always, so Al not being, too keen on projectile vomiting from either of his children,
don't start that.
That's quite real. But actually, it's just something that is kind of it's there for the kind of hashtag info banter piece that we do. But also, we're very conscious that if we go over an hour and we're still prattling on, sometimes it just can get like, it just might get too much for some people. So yeah.
But it's purposeful, our banter. I think that people think it's just us having a banter, but I think from the outset, I've always realized that isolation is one of the huge issues for all parents. That sense of, I used to have this life and now I'm sat watching Teletubbies in alone.
Absolutely.
Watching kids. There's that huge sense of isolation. And I wanted the podcast to be really somewhere where you would put it on and you'd feel like you'd walked in a room with two people talking about adoption, and they were old mates and they were having a laugh, and it was dark at times, and it's interesting, it's information, but also it gets you access to places you wouldn't normally go. We get people like you on, and the reality is it costs a lot of money to get to some of the events that we speak at. And so actually let's get these people on, and so we're spreading that joy. So we feel like we're meeting lots of needs, and actually the primary reason is that I think Scott and I do it is we do it for ourselves.
Well, you get to speak to whoever you want to, and my why for doing a podcast is the same as yours. I love the idea of people dropping in on a conversation, because that's what it is, isn't it? When you listen to a podcast, there is some part of you that feels like you're earwigging on something you shouldn't quite be listening to. You're dropping in on a conversation, and my kind of why was very much around making as many conversations across the sectors as accessible as possible, so that people had an opportunity to hear other people's challenges, funnies, and connectors. The things that bring us together are what I'm interested in, connection, not the things that tear us apart. And I also only go for about 30 minutes for the podcast, of which we're coming to the end of that. And I know we could talk all night, but the reason that I keep it very short is for the same reasons that you said, is because people are, there's only so much trauma people can listen to, even though we haven't even touched upon that. And secondly, people are so time restrained. So I would just like to ask both of you to just very quickly, what would you like to leave people listening to this with? Al?
I have no idea how to answer that question, really. What would... Scott, you say something, because my mind's gone blank.
Honestly, see,
you so looked like you were thinking then. I believed you. Scott.
Right, yes. So what I would like people to leave thinking after listening to this podcast is that actually podcasters work quite hard. It's a hobby to most. I mean, there was a time about 18 months ago where Al and I said, right, is it time to hang this up, or is it time to kind of really go full pelt with it? And we decided to go full pelt with it. But it's not, and I don't do half as much work as Al at the minute. I hope that will change once I put my feet up and give up work for a while. But it is such hard work. But actually, it means so much when you get feedback. Feedback's really important. And when you have people asking to come on as well, that's a really key part of it. But what I would say is that, podcasts are for the listeners. And whilst we get something out of it, I get a massive amount out of it, but actually it's what the listeners want to hear, what they want to listen to. So, any podcast that doesn't listen to that feedback, there's a number of big names out there that are doing podcasts, and I cringe at them because, they're not listening to the listeners, they're doing what they want to do. And
we want to listen to the people. We want to listen to the people. Al?
Well, I think that one of the things that we have, the most important thing I think any of us have, is our story. And I think that, I mean, I guess there's a whole host of things that I'd have loved to have talked about. I mean, as a podcast, I think we aspire to be a force for change. And how we do that is through sharing stories. And because I think stories change minds, change hearts, change opinions, change politicians, change legislation. And I think we're in for the long haul, aren't we, Scott? Well, I am. Get on board. This idea, I think that it's been the most remarkable opportunity to listen to some people's stories. And there's been a few times I've been in tears listening to people's stories, and I think that it's such a privilege to share that. And sometimes, I come away and I go, oh, I don't think I'd like to meet you in real life. That's Scott. No, and sometimes I've come away with more questions, but it's made me think, and I remember the stories, not the lecture. I remember these swelling emotions, and I love that. I asked one person about what was it like to adopt, and 10 minutes later they were telling me about the troubles they were having with their husband, and I kind of thought, wow, people are just desperate to talk.
And I think that's such a good place to leave it. We need spaces to talk, to connect, to communicate with each other. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Big love to you, and take care.
And to you, and you. Stay well.
Oh.
Bon Jovi.
Buongiorno.
Bye.
Anchovy, tata.